I first became interested in what happens to young people when I was myself diagnosed with attention deficit disorder at age 54. What I didn't know at the time, because nobody taught me in medical school, and they still don't teach this in medical school, is that the human brain actually develops in interaction with the environment. So that a lot of the things that happen in the brain are not because of genetics, they're not because of bad hereditary programming, but actually because of what happens to people in life, particularly in the first few years. So that many of the problems that you deal with in the youth shelters, with the clients that you deal with, they're actually coping mechanisms that these kids developed, which became then fixed in their brains. And later on, these early coping mechanisms become source of a problem. Because as a 1-year-old, if I tuned out, if there was a lot of stress going on, that was the coping mechanism. But then if I tune out, later on, that becomes a problem. Because now I can't pay attention, and I won't be able to follow instructions. So what begins as a coping mechanism, later on becomes a problem. If you take a small child at birth who's got perfectly good eyes, and he can see as much as a baby can see, which is not much, but they can see some stuff. But if you put that child in a dark room for 5 years, so he never sees light, he'll be blind thereafter for the rest of his life. Because the circuits of vision require light waves to develop. So if that kid doesn't see light, even the circuits that are present at birth will actually die, and new ones will not develop. And that kid is blind thereafter for the rest of his life. Because for vision, you need the stimulation of light waves. If you look at the problems of the young people that you deal with, what areas do you identify problems with? Well, first of all, they have poor impulse control. Whatever occurs to them, they'll blurt it out if they're acted out. If they're aggressive, they'll act it out. If they're upset, they'll scream at somebody. So there's no impulse control. There's nothing up here that says, you shouldn't do this right now. Don't do this. You may feel like screaming, but don't scream. Impulse control is, I see this muffin over here, and I really like it, the way it looks, and I'm going to grab it. It's a blueberry muffin, and I really like blueberry muffins. I'm going to grab it and eat it. Well, that's my impulse, is to grab that muffin. But something up here says, not a good idea. It's not your muffin. It belongs to somebody else. Besides, you're in the middle of giving a speech right now. This is no time to be eating muffins. And if you do that, they might not invite you back again. So there's nothing wrong with the impulse to grab the muffin, but there'd be something wrong with me acting it out. Up here in my brain, right where I'm pointing actually, behind the right eye, is a part of the gray matter of the brain that is supposed to regulate impulses, stop me from acting out the inappropriate impulse. These kids that you're dealing with, they don't have impulse regulation. That part of the brain never developed for many of them. And that's one of the features of ADD, by the way, is poor impulse control. Another brain circuit that needs to develop is stress regulation, so that when I'm stressed, I can handle it. I can calm myself down. I don't have to act it out. I don't have to reach for a substance. Because, substances, drug use is all about, or at least in some ways, is about controlling stress. So that when you're very stressed, that's when you're going to go on, and if you have an eating problem, for example, it's when you're stressed, then you're going to go home and eat a bunch of cookies. Or if you have a drinking problem, it's when you're stressed that you're going to go and drink a lot. Or act out whatever addiction that you've got, if you don't have stress regulation. Motivation, incentive, our ability to do things, or our drive to do things in a focused kind of way, that's another brain circuit that has to develop. People who are addicted to crystal meth, for example, when I was treated for ADHD, what was I given? I was given Dexedrine or Adderall, one of these medications. What do these medications do? They elevate the level of a chemical in the brain called dopamine. Now, dopamine is an important brain chemical that's essential for incentive and motivation, to feel more alive and to feel curious and vibrant. There's been an experiment with mice. When you take this little mouse in a laboratory and you put some food in his mouth and he eats it and he chews it and he swallows it and he likes it, but if you put the food down a few inches away from his nose, he won't budge to eat it. In fact, will starve to death rather than to eat. Why? Because genetically they knocked out his dopamine receptors. So this brain chemical of incentive, the dopamine, just isn't there for him. Therefore, he's not motivated to do anything. Well, for the brain circuitry of motivation and dopamine, this brain chemical to develop, you also need the right conditions. So I'm not going to go through all the brain history here, except to tell you that the important brain circuits that regulate human behavior and emotional self-control and incentive and motivation all need the right environment. Just like you need the right environment for vision, you also need the right environment for these other circuits to develop. The opiate addicts, the kids who are into OxyContin or heroin or morphine, one of these opiate drugs. Well, we also have an opiate apparatus in our brain. We have a natural opiate apparatus. These natural opiates are called endorphins. Endorphin means endogenous morphine-like substance. We have our own opiates. Why do we have our own opiates? Anybody know why we have our own opiates? What do they do? What do opiates do in general? What's that? Manage pain. Opiates are the most powerful pain regulators that we have. So heroin, morphine, and codeine, these are powerful painkillers. We have our own. And the reason that the opiates work in our brains is because we have receptors for them. We have chemical sites in our brains where these external chemicals can bind. The reason we have these chemical sites in our brains is because we have our own internal opiates. And the internal opiates, they do three things for us. They regulate our pain, our own natural opiates. They regulate our pain. Secondly, they give us a sense of reward and pleasure. So whenever you're happy, whenever you're elated, people that go bungee jumping, for example, if you measure their endorphin levels, the higher the endorphin level, the greater the elation, the greater the joy. So whenever you feel joy and happiness, it's because you got endorphins flowing in your brain. So that's the second thing that they do. First being pain control. The third thing that they do is the most important. They actually make possible the experience of love. So that, now love is really important. When I say love, I don't just mean the gooey, sentimental, romantic feeling of love. I mean the connection, the attachment between mother and child. It's because the infant and the mother both have endorphins in their brains that they're able to connect with each other. So if you take infant mice and you knock out their endorphin receptors, genetically, they will not be crying for their mothers if you separate them from their mothers. And what would that mean in the wild? What would happen to a small mouse in the wild if she didn't cry for the mother on separation? What would happen to that mouse? Well, they become prey. They die because only the mother protects the child. So that the opiate addict, the OxyContin addict, the heroin addict, what are they looking for? They're looking for pain relief. They're looking for a sense of pleasure and reward. And they're looking for a sense of connection. So a sex trade worker once said to me, she was 27, she was a heroin addict, and I asked her what heroin did for her. She said, the first time I did heroin, it felt like a warm, soft hug. A warm, soft hug. It gave you an experience of love. Well, those circuits have to develop in our brains. And the people that are prone to addicted are the ones in whom these circuits just didn't develop. But why not? Why not? Because the conditions weren't right. So just as you need light for the stimulation of the visual circuits to develop, for the circuits of self-regulation, emotional regulation, balance, stress regulation, pain relief, pleasure and reward, love and connection, incentive and motivation, you also need the right environment. And the necessary environment for those circuits is the presence of parenting caregivers who are emotionally available, consistently available, non-stressed, non-depressed, and attuned to you, capable of connecting with you. So the necessary condition for the development of these key brain circuits is the presence of non-stressed, non-depressed, emotionally available, consistently available, attuned parenting caregivers. And when kids don't have that, their brains don't develop the right way. And then they're prone to soothe themselves with drugs. And then they're prone to act out impulsively and not to be able to regulate their emotions. And then to be aggressive and so on and so forth. In other words, the kids that you're all dealing with are people who didn't have the right conditions. And not only didn't have the right conditions for development, so not only what they're doing is not deliberate behavior on their part. There's no choice in the matter. It's that their brains don't give them the capacity to behave any differently. So you're actually dealing with people who have been traumatized because under conditions of trauma, these circuits don't develop. Now I can tell you that in the downtown east side of Vancouver, with the drug-addicted population that I work with, all of them had been traumatized. Every single one had been traumatized. The women are all being sexually abused, and they all have been physically abused, male or female, emotionally neglected and abandoned. And that meant two things. It meant three things, actually. Well, it meant many things. But the three major things it meant is, number one, their sense of the world was that this is not a world that I can trust. And especially, I can't trust caregivers, because caregivers hurt me. Because most of the time that kids are traumatized, it happens in their families of origin. So the people that are supposed to look after me, the people that are supposed to care for me, the people that are supposed to nurture me, I can't trust them. Guess what? They don't trust you. Because you're the authority figures that are supposed to help them and care for them and look after them. Why would they trust you? Their experience is that you can't trust these people, they will hurt you. So they will look at you with suspicion very often. Not because you deserve the suspicion, but because that's how they see the world. That's the first thing. The second thing is that, I mentioned that when I was diagnosed with ADD, I was given dexedrine. Now what does dexedrine do? Dexedrine elevates the level of dopamine in the brain. Dopamine, of course, gives you more incentive, motivation, and focus. It's a stimulant. Now, what else elevates dopamine? Caffeine does. It's a stimulant. Nicotine does. It's a stimulant. Cocaine does. It's a stimulant. And crystal meth does. It's another stimulant. A lot of these people are self-medicating. So a lot of these kids who are into crystal meth are actually self-medicating ADD. They're trying to give themselves more dopamine up here. So these people were very much prone to be self-medicating. Some of them will self-medicate with the opiates. Some of them will self-medicate with cigarettes or alcohol or whatever. These are all self-medications. And the third thing is, they have very poor self-control because the circuits of self-control did not develop in their lives. So, they don't trust you, they self-medicate, and they have poor impulse control. Well, that means you've got a real job on your hands, don't you? Well, the reason I'm telling you this is because sometimes there's a tendency to take the behaviors of our clients personally. It's not personal to you. This is them, given their history. And they can't really help it. So the challenge is, how do you work with a population who has been traumatized and who act out their trauma, sometimes in ways that are very difficult to deal with, and who don't trust you to start with? And how do you do that without being traumatized yourself? Because the focus of this day is actually what's been called vicarious trauma. The trauma that comes from being with or working with people who are themselves traumatized.